Hello, everybody, and welcome to Classroom Psychology. I'm your host, Cora. Thank you so very, very much for joining me. It is wonderful to see you, as always, and I hope you're doing okay. Pull up a chair. Let's talk about gender diversity. You know, whatever it is that you like to do while we talk about gender diversity, you do you. But I'm going to pull up a chair. We're going to get all cozy. Let's talk about classroom psychology. And this week, much like we do every time we come together, we take a confidently declared statement from a politician or public figure, or sometimes a famous book author, or in this case, a playwright, a journalist, and kind of political satirist from Northern Ireland. And he's on GB News, I think, fairly frequently. At least he used to be. And he has some very interesting things to say about gender identity, but we take their confidently declared statements for the questions we're sure they're intended to be. I'm sure, come on, they're questions. And we take them for the questions we hope they're intended to be, and we see if we can't find an answer together by reviewing the scientific literature, or in this case, by interviewing an expert in the field. Our question today comes from Andrew Doyle, again, playwright, journalist, political activist, and commentator on GB News. So, again, as always, a quick clip from Andrew Doyle. But Andrew Doyle's commentary is satirical. It's aiming to be funny. And he makes trans folk and gender identity in particular the sort of butt of a set of quite low-hanging fruit jokes. So forgive me in advance for showing this, and please look after yourself as you watch and or listen. But we're going to take it for the question that we're sure is intended to be. Here is Andrew Doyle.
And there are so many of these clips online with teachers on TikTok talking about how they've come out to their students as polysexual or abrosexual or pangender or demigender or whatever gender identity has been invented that week. And of course, all of this is ideological in nature. It is akin to a religious belief. By all means, we should be able to talk about these new cultural developments. But teaching ideological belief systems to children as though they are uncontested fact is actually against the law. And telling pupils to use they and them as singular pronouns isn't going to go down too well when they end up failing their English exams.
Andrew Doyle. Thanks so very much to Andrew Doyle for such an interesting question, posed as they often are, by making, gender diverse folk the butt of very low hanging fruit, to the sort of muffled laughter of like 5 people, because that's about the number of people who found it funny. But we'll take it for the question we're sure it's intended to be, and hey, we'll see if we can't find an answer together. Now, Andrew Doyle's question, it takes a little bit of scraping beneath the surface to find, but in here it claims that gender identity is a religious belief of sorts, that it's an ideology that's contested. I know that central government, as was the Conservative government, many times said that gender identity was a contested belief, which is fascinating. And it claims that, gender identity is this belief system, a way of thinking about gender that isn't supported by the literature. So I'm curious to know, is gender identity specifically, the concept of gender identity, what is it? What does the literature suggest that it is? And, how does it develop, and how stable is it over time, and what influences it? I'm really interested in all of those things. Thankfully, we have an expert who can answer all of those questions, because she was very recently published in the British Journal of Developmental Psychology. We have the legendary Dr. Ellie Fisher, who conducted a systematic review looking at all of the studies that have been published on the topic of gender identity in children and young people, how it develops and what influences it. So I am so pleased to get the opportunity to speak with Dr. Fisher today. She's one of my heroes. Absolutely amazing piece of work in the British Journal of Developmental Psychology. So glad you get the opportunity to spend some time with her too. So here is the inimitable Dr. Ellie Fisher. So let me start by asking, that's a bit of a weird way of thinking about gender identity to my mind. But like, what led you to do this work? Was it in response to that kind of view of gender identity?
Yeah, so it's a weird way of thinking it to me as well. And I also think it's kind of all a lot of the different ways that people think about gender identity are quite different. And I find it quite unusual when people just stick to one of the different ways that you can think about gender identity. Because to me, it felt quite complicated. And I think often people feel that, or try to make it a bit less complicated to make it kind of easier for them to understand. But it was
Right.
something in the research that I found as well, that sometimes when people were talking about gender identity, they were talking about the way someone dresses. Sometimes they were talking about the things that they were interested in, and whether they aligned with kind of societal stereotypes around masculinity and femininity. Sometimes
Right.
they were
Right.
talking about things like sometimes they were genuinely talking about how someone felt within themselves, and it all seemed to be a bit different. People have different ideas around it. So it's just an interesting thing.
That's fascinating. So there was so that's interesting. There's like you got the sense that there was a diversity of perspective around what gender identity is at the core. Um, is that so? Is that why the systematic review is on the cards for you? Like, did you manage to at all resolve any of that controversy in the work that you did?
I like to think that I managed to show that it's not as that it is more complicated than people think, and that it can't be simplified to kind of one very black and white perspective, and that actually there are so many things that are incorporated um to make up somebody's gender identity, and to that we have to bring together, that I like to think that it kind of brought an end to being able to sort of try and condense it into one way of thinking, and showed the complexity of it. That's what I hope. But
Oh, that's interesting. So, just to catch you there, like, it sounds like it's that on my approach to this was like, oh, hey, these kind of conservative views of gender identity are kind of problematic. But it sounds like you're also saying that, on all sides of this, any sort of oversimplified view of gender identity is equally problematic.
yeah, I think what happens is if two people have oversimplified views of what gender identity is, and they're talking to one another, they're quite often talking about something very different. So someone might be talking about someone's gendered expression, the way that they present themselves to the world, whereas another person may be talking more about kind of like an inner feeling of belonging to a certain group, or they may be talking about wildly different concepts. And so then if you're trying to compare research, they may have measured things differently, depending on what their understanding of gender identity is, and which of those types of parts of someone's gender identity they think are most important to them. And I think quite often that is something that I come across when people are fearful of, like you said, this kind of, or they feel that it's a new thing that's arrived, and it's kind of scary, and it's sweeping people up. And when people are fearful of gender identity, I think sometimes it can be because they're talking about a very different thing to other people. Everyone's kind of simplifying it in their own way, but it kind of doesn't match up. And actually, it's, bringing all of that together can make it make a bit more sense.
Gosh, that's so. I mean, it's interesting, not least because of last week's episode or last time's episode. Might not be last week that we released it. Uh, Andreas was talking to us about one of the big challenges is in getting any kind of consensus, and that people can find it hard to agree on. I mean, essentially, his work was about statements about gender, so using language to describe gender to people, and people finding it hard to agree. Essentially, even when the kind of methodology is designed to gain consensus. So maybe one of the reasons it sounds like is because even the core understandings of what, like, even a term like gender identity or gender expression, are you finding that maybe there isn't a good agreement of those concepts then?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. And that I think is what makes it quite difficult to compare research, to find a kind of narrative that explains gender identity over time, because often research is coming at it from very different perspectives around what it is that they're actually measuring. So I don't know if that was where I started. When I wanted to start my research, I was thinking more about the stability of gender identity. And actually, I realized that we couldn't really go into the stability of gender identity when it wasn't clear. There wasn't a clear consensus around what gender identity is in all of those papers that we were looking at.
Wow.
They were all thinking about kind of different things or measuring different things, or some would use a combination of two things, others would use a combination of five measures, and that is what I kind of ultimately found, is that you get very different trajectories of someone's gender identity, and depending on which of those things you're looking at. So if you looked at someone's clothing preferences as an indication of their gender identity, they might change quite a bit over time. We all kind of have different phases of wearing different things and different preferences, whereas their sort of self-identification, their sense of their self might actually stay very stable. But if someone is measuring someone's gender identity or making an assumption about their gender identity based on what they look like or how they present themselves, then they may perceive it to be more unstable than someone who thinks of gender identity as something that is kind of a core feeling, or something innate that is not necessarily associated with how you look on the outside. So I think
Fascinating.
that's where I kind of found an interest, and that's where the research then ended up going.
That's so interesting. I finding that idea is so wonderfully nuanced. There's a couple of things that like I wanted to ask about. I think the first one is about, just to kind of contextualize it. You mentioned the idea of gender identity, and you said that people kind of get I think you said something about people finding it that it's a kind of new concept in people's minds. In your understanding of it, to what extent is gender identity in the modern like way of thinking about it a modern idea in that way? Is it new?
I don't think so. I think from my understanding, there's been gender diversity for as long as people have been around, and it was much more, and I think possibly now there is more acceptance from some, not as much as we would hope, but more acceptance, and that might mean that it's becoming more of a part of people's lives than possibly
Right.
it was when there was less acceptance in the kind of Western society that we live in. But it's something that you can find research on a long time ago, something you can find research on in different cultures, something that you can find that has always existed. So to me, it doesn't feel like a new idea at all. It just feels that there's, for some reason at this moment, there's this huge kind of surgence of people speaking about it, people possibly overestimating how common it is for someone to be gender diverse. And that's quite strange to me, because it's quite clear from my reading, but also just from, I don't know, just existing in the world for as long as I have, just that it's always something that's been present, but for whatever reason at the moment, it just seems to have exploded into this big debate.
That's fascinating. So the language of like it's found its way into the cultural zeitgeist more modernly. That's super cool. I like that idea because it sort of sets a good context for your work, which is trying to understand. So what is this thing then? The other thing that before we get into what you found, because I'm so desperately interested to learn more about it, but the one of the things that strikes me is the idea like that gender expression as a sort of a means by which you might have some idea about somebody's gender identity is one of the measures that people sometimes used. You tell us more about that. What was the research that used kind of gender expression as a proxy for gender identity or as some kind of indicator? What did it do?
Yeah, so gendered expression was actually more commonly used across the studies that ended up being in my systematic review as a measure than self-identification, because a lot of the research that I was looking at was thinking about children and their gender identity as they get older. And actually, there is a point in a child's life where it would be difficult to get a self-identification from them when they're very, very little. So some of the research, when we're thinking about gendered preferences and whether they fit with the stereotypes, things like toy preferences, their activity preferences, their clothing preferences, all of those things are the ways that researchers are trying to collect data about a child's gender identity before they're able to self-identify using language. So some of the studies that are quite old now, but they looked at babies as young as kind of 6 months old, and it's things like their gaze and whether they show more a preference for looking at stereotypically male toys or female toys, however they categorize those, and look at whether those preferences are evident in a child's gaze and whether they stay that way as they get older. There are studies about what after school activities children do, and whether they fit with kind of cultural ideas around masculinity and femininity. There's one really bizarre study that I'd have to go back to my notes to look at which one it is, but where young people were asked to dress up in opposite gender stereotyped clothing. So children who had been assigned male at birth were asked to dress up in a dress, and the measure was about how much they refused. So how unwilling they were to get in the clothes, and or whether they were super willing, and then they use that to give quite often they combine these things to get a measure of gender conformity, is what they would then use as the language to describe when you put together all of their clothing preferences and their toys and the other one is whether they choose to spend time with girls or boys. So kind of intergroup bias. So whether they feel that affinity towards girls or boys that they're spending time within their peer group. But a lot of those studies are from researchers trying to observe children and try and kind of make those guesses around their gender identity, and they're using those kind of more external kind of expressions, so their clothing and their preferences and their kind of even their social interactions. But those measures are still used as they get older, even when a child is able to self-identify, because I think people are often quite dubious about a child's ability to self-identify, which means that you still see some of those kind of those measures where they're just being very I don't know how they make the list of what conforms to what, but they're not necessarily standardized measures where you see the same measures coming up in lots of these papers. They're quite often researchers' judgments about how much that child is gender conforming or not gender conforming.
Right. So researchers are making the call about to what extent they're comfortable in their kind of chosen gender expression, and whether their gender expression matches some cultural kind of stereotype about what is feminine and what is masculine.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So when people look at gender expression as a kind of proxy for gender, I think the first thing is I didn't. Of course, it makes perfect sense that this comes from research with children too young to ask. That's fascinating, but also, I guess, interesting that continued to be the case even with older children.
Yes. Yeah.
Is it because, like, you might not know, but is it because it's the kind of the concept of being able to ask a young person or a child, how they identify is itself seen as potentially not, like, the irony is that is seen as less valid than the gender expression measure.
Yeah, that was what was very strange to me, because actually when you do then get studies later on down the line where they have accepted that as their kind of measure and decided that that would be a valid thing to do, you quite often do see stability in a child's judgment about their own gender over time. Whereas those clothing preferences change loads, even things like when a child gets control over what they wear. So you get a difference between a child whose outfit will have been chosen by their parents when they're dropped off to go and meet the researcher who's going to decide whether their clothing is conforming or not conforming to their sex assigned at birth. And it may be that their parent has put them in some sort of outfit that is more conforming or not non-conforming, depending on what their parents are like or what their preferences are. And then later down the line, they may have turned up to meet the researcher choosing their own outfit. And that might then mean that that is quite unstable in terms of what it would look like over time. So if you were using a measure like that to say that someone's gender identity has changed over time, it could be as simple as how much autonomy they have over their own clothing or how much autonomy they have over their own life. So it's interesting because again, it could be that with toys that they've been more familiar with particular toys because those are the things that their parents, having always existed in a world that is very binary in the way that it views gender, they may have just provided certain toys for their child that are more aligned with a stereotype. So the more autonomous a child becomes, it kind of that can mean that those measures can appear quite unstable over time, or it could be that they I don't know, it might not be because of autonomy, but it could, sometimes researchers wonder about whether it could be about which clues a child is using to decide on and which and how much adults are interacting them in a way that's with them in a way that is consistent with societal norms, whether they're going to school and there are other children who are kind of perpetuating some of those binary ideas. There's so many things that could impact on somebody's presentation and how they choose to express themselves to the world because of things like wanting to fit in and because of parents having control over what we do or because of the way that adults in our school or our preschool speak to us. Whereas the kind of, so it's unusual to me that seems to have been taken as more of a valid measure than somebody being able to describe how they're feeling within themselves. Even if we are asking children, I think, that's quite strange to me.
Yeah, fascinating. I say fascinating so frequently. I say fascinating because it is fascinating. So interesting that children are influenced in their choices in their preferences, not only by, of course, the internal drives, things that they actually prefer, but also by the countless societal social pressures and encouragement and discouragement and all the unconscious and conscious processes that go on around kids. I can see why things would be quite unstable in appearance just simply because of those pressures changing and fluctuating. And I loved your point about autonomy. I'd never considered that. Of course, that the older children get, the more autonomous they become in their clothing choices and their preferences. And so the less guided they might be by societal pressures and the more guided they might be by internal, what they actually prefer. But then the social and societal pressures become greater as they go to school and they learn from their... so complicated for researchers to square that circle. I
would love to look at, there is some initial research that started to look at this, but a long time ago, not recently, but trying to work out when a child is talking about gender, what are they using to make a judgment about their gender? And it seems that when they're younger, they refer much more to someone's hair or their clothes or their expression. And then as they get older, more about their kind of identity and sense of self. So as that changes over time, the things that they're using to make that judgment about other people's gender, but also their own gender, if that's how they're understanding gender. Again, that's a really interesting factor that kind of messes things up a little bit. It kind of makes things a bit more muddy because, so I think over time, children's kind of reasoning and the way that they think and the kind of logic that they're able to access and all of that kind of becomes relevant as well because they that will be what's kind of helping them to make judgments about their own feelings and their own sense of self and their as well as others. So it's interesting.
Right. Right.
Mm.
Okay, so what happens if people like what else do people use to measure gender identity if not gender expression? What alternatives did people have available to them?
So when I kind of was doing my systematic review, I ended up when I was doing my analysis of the studies that we chose to include, I ended up trying to categorize them into these groups. And I think overall, all of the studies that I used could kind of fit into whether they mainly used self-identification. So being able to just ask a participant how they feel about their gender identity, how they would self-identify. That within that kind of category of self-identification, you had some measures that were more binary, so where children were asked, are you a boy or a girl? Other times where you might have had additional categories for neither a boy or a girl. Then we sort of started to move towards putting boy at one end of the scale and girl at another end of the scale, and allowing a bit more of a fluid decision where a child is allowed to put themselves kind of somewhere on a scale of boy to girl. And then you start to move into having boyness on a scale and kind of girlness on a scale, and in recognition that anybody may be able to kind of identify with both boyness or masculinity and both girlness or femininity. So then ending up with more poles that you're using to self-identify. So even within this kind of self-identification, there were different complexities of measures. Then we had all of the kind of object and activity preferences. So like I said before, more of that kind of things that are more observable for a researcher. So it was toys, it was the activities that they choose to do outside of school, it was things like the preferential looking from the babies and things, whether they were looking towards certain things. Then clothing preference comes up so much, which I found really bizarre. I didn't think that would be a particularly reliable way of kind of collecting data about someone's gender identity, but clothing preferences are in loads of studies. I guess because it's kind of a quick thing that a researcher can do and just record very quickly and easily. And then the last kind of group that I found in terms of groups of studies and the measures they use was peer preferences. So this is all about, like I kind of hinted at before, intergroup bias. So it's kind of based on the theory that when you feel that you belong to a group, you automatically kind of, whether it's consciously or unconsciously, have a bias towards other members who you perceive to be part of that group. So they looked at children's peer preferences and how many of their friends belonged to a certain gender group, and whether that correlated with or not with the sex that they've been assigned at birth. And so then again, it's kind of grouped into gender congruent or gender, what's the other one? It's come out of my head.
Incongruent?
Yeah, like gender congruent and incongruent, or like gender diverse, gender normative kind of friendships. That's the other one that they look at. So all of the studies that ended up being included had measures that fitted into one of those categories or more than one or all of them. But in terms of the numbers, I'm just looking, 4 of the studies that were in my systematic review had self-identification measures. So actually that's not that many.
Yeah.
14 of them used the object and activity preferences. 8 used clothing preferences. So again, quite a high number. And 7 used the peer preferences. So actually in terms of self-identification, it was quite low in terms of the measures that they were using in the studies that I had included, which in total was 80, no, 21.
21 studies in this review.
Yeah.
Wow. And only 4 of them looked at self-ID. Did I miscount? Wow. Okay, that's interesting. So it's kind of interesting in and of itself, the idea that the way that researchers conceive of gender identity is, I guess, it's slightly at odds with the way that at least I tend to think of it, which is that it's very difficult to assume somebody's gender identity unless you can ask them. And yet most researchers chose not to ask them and used other methods. Although, appreciably, a lot of the kids are too young to ask. And so, you're talking about preferential looking. I'm guessing that's very, very young children.
Yeah.
Can I ask about preferential looking? Did they find anything particularly interesting in the preferential looking stuff?
It was really, it was interesting. So I'm just looking. So they were quite often used in the kind of early 2000s. So they're quite old studies. But there were 2 that were included then into my review. And in those 2, they did some activities that they were trying to use to understand whether at that age a child had that kind of intergroup bias or that sense of belonging to a group. So they also showed them pictures of men and women or children their own age who were boys and girls to see whether they showed a kind of recognition that they belonged to the same group as the person in one of those photos. And they found in those studies that kind of at 18 months, they weren't showing that same kind of sex segregation as it's described in some of the studies, and they weren't showing that same kind of like self-identification as an older child may do. So they were suggesting that at that age, even when they didn't necessarily have an idea of their own gender, they weren't necessarily showing that intergroup bias and showing that they aligned themselves with other people who were men or women. They were still showing some of these gender stereotyped preferences. So I'm just looking at the ages, but they looked at children between 3 and 18 months. So even 3 months old, which is really young, and they were looking at whether their gaze was, they showed a preference for male or female stereotype toys, and they found that they could see some of these preferences that aligned with kind of societal norms around what is stereotypically gender congruent or gender incongruent from babies who were as young as 6 months. And then they found, and then other studies found that babies who were that young, who showed a preference, continued to show that kind of congruity or incongruence as they got older to when they were kind of 3 and 4 years old. So what I found really interesting was that even at such a young age, kind of 6 months old, babies were showing preferences for masculine or feminine stereotyped toys without necessarily having that self-identification, that self-understanding of their gender. Right. So that's really interesting to me.
Yeah, so these kids, of course, they're not. Most of those kids grow up to be more gender typical as young kids, right? These aren't. I suppose even at that age you wouldn't know, but this is the general population. Yeah. So in most people, they do show some sort of preferences for particular gendered activities, toys, or peers, even in very young ages. But it becomes more stable over time. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, yeah. So I've said 6 months, and I've realized now that it's 9 months because I'm now looking at the thing better.
That's okay.
Prior to that, so basically at 3 months old, both in the general population, both sexes showed a preference for masculine toys, And there's theories about whether that's because they are more kind of, they're moving more, they're kind of less static than things like a doll, and they're more kind of colourful. But by 9 months, when they were split into male and female groups, the preferences, there were gender congruent preferences by the age of 9 months. But they were most significant in the male group because, as we found, like some of those male toys, supposedly male toys, are quite interesting to look at and kind of see to
Right.
capture the attention of all of the babies that they included in the studies.
Right.
So yeah,
Wow.
that's another thing that's interesting, is kind of some of those preferences forming before children are able to kind of self-identify or show that intergroup bias. That's something that I found particularly interesting. Not explained
Yeah.
very well, but
You've explained it beautifully. I am grasping what you mean. I guess it's slightly counterintuitive, which is what might make it difficult to understand. But it makes sense that these kids are showing some type of preferential behaviors towards certain kinds of toys, even at ages that are younger than could have been informed by social desirability
yeah.
or by even by self ID or by so there might be some differences in different children in terms of their looking, and those might be guided by the same kind of things as sexual development, or like sex difference development in children's brains, etc. Right? Fascinating. Okay. Yeah, I think it was interesting. One of the controversial moments in the Cass review, Hilary Cass talks about like the biological basis of preferential of like toy preferences, etc. And she was a bit mocked, I think, for that assertion. But it sounds like in here there might be some biological basis for like gendered toy preferences, but it might not be as simple as we prefer boy things or we prefer girl things, but rather there might be qualities of boy toys that are just interesting in a particular way compared to sort of girl toys in heavily inverted commas.
Yeah.
But and those might sort of draw in different children in different ways, and there might be some sex differences in kind of which ones people prefer.
Yeah, and I think the thing that was interesting about it, I'm kind of trying to make sure I remember it right, but is that often the most congruence between the stereotypes and the preferences were in children who were assigned male at birth. So,
Right.
and that could be something to do with the toys. Could be that the toys are more kind of more colourful, more bright, more kind of have more movement. But it also could be, if we're thinking about boys as they get a bit older, it could be that the way that adults are interacting with them is more stereotyped with boys than it is with girls. So it could
Oh
be
wow.
that kind of
Oh wow. Yes.
that people find it harder to be kind of to interact with a child that they are assuming is a boy in a way that is not in line with the stereotypes than they would
Right.
play with a girl in a way that's not in line with the stereotypes.
Gosh. So that might explain why they don't show up at 3 months as much as they show up at 9 months, because while they're not going to be influenced socially in quite the way you might expect young children to be influenced socially by what their friends are into, what their parents encourage them to play with, there might be ways in which we, quite probably unconscious ways, interact with children we think are boys versus those we think are girls that might encourage them, like change how they develop in a way that might give them a preference for certain kinds of toys. So there might be still social impacts even at these extremely young ages that might explain that difference.
So that was what was interesting when I had my work peer reviewed, was somebody brought my attention to the work of Fausto Sterling, which is very much about that. So it's about embodiment, which is kind of a concept where we talk about the interaction between a biological kind of entity, so human, and their environment, and particularly thinking about kind of motor activity and sensory activities. And so they were saying that, the way that an adult touches or interacts with a child, even at such a young age, could influence their preferences and the things that they're more comfortable playing with, and that there may be kind
Wow.
of ways that we interact with children that we've assigned as boys rather than girls, and that could be kind of having an impact. But I always came back to the same kind of with these things that I do think it's so interesting to think about all of these different kind of social influences that could be kind of having an impact. But I always think there are still those gender diverse children who may well have been interacted with in these ways, who may well have had all of the same pressures and all of the same kind of social pressures and social guidance from people who are trying to kind of demonstrate to them the binary systems that we all work within, who actually still don't align with the sex that they're assigned at birth. So although I think all of these things could kind of be having an influence, they still often don't explain why, even with all of that influence, there are still trans people in the world. There are still people who are not modified by all of these kind of factors. There's something innate to them that mean that they have these preferences and they have this feeling of alignment or not alignment with a certain group. And so it was something that ended up being mentioned in my discussion. I started to think about, could this be having an impact? But still sort of came back to the same thing, that it can't explain the things for everybody, because there will always be people who do not conform to the way that they have been interacted with as a baby.
That's brilliant. Yes. So, I mean, your point that we started on has clearly come to fruition. This idea that that it's important that we think about this in a nuanced way,
Mhm.
because it's actually quite complicated. There are sort of there might be some biological effects going on that mean that there are kind of maybe essential differences in brain development that have shaped like how children what their preferences are and their kind of interests and how they identify. And then there might be social influences that shape gender identity in terms of toy and clothing preferences and what's expected in the environment. But even despite all of that, there's still trans folk in the world, which kind of evidence that gender identity can't be shaped in like completely socially. So I guess the other point that we started on is this kind of that there might be a meaningful distinction between gender expression, which has these kind of some biological drivers perhaps, but quite a lot of social drivers by the sounds of things that change over time. Were there any measures that were in the systematic review that looked at gender identity sort of as how people sort of actually identified sans any expression? Although, of course, they're expressing their gender identity verbally, so it's still kind of expression. But is there any, like you mentioned self-ID in there, how people sort of identified?
There was a study by Gulgos and colleagues in 2022, where they used the gender spectrum continuum. So that was a spectrum that went from, so a scale that a child was asked to rate themselves on, from I feel totally like a boy to feel totally like a girl at the other end of the spectrum. So it's still not quite evolved to the point that some of the studies more recently are at, where we have separate measures for those two things. But it was still more of a kind of spectrum measure than some of the other studies where people were just asked, how do you identify? And it was expected that there would kind of be one of three answers. So this was a bit more nuanced. And it was over a kind of 2-year time period. I think some was slightly less than 2 years, but 1 to 2 year time period. And they found that there was kind of this moderate stability in the way that participants identified using the spectrum measure. So that would suggest that having that more nuanced approach to a self-identification is helpful, and actually they also found that it was very unusual for any of their participants to rate themselves as feeling totally like a girl or totally like a boy. So actually that would suggest that some of those more nuanced spaces were needed for those children to be able to self-identify. It was children who were between kind of 7 years old and then 9 years old over time. And it was found that, yeah, how they used this measure did seem to stay stable over time. And it was also interesting in there was a qualitative paper, and in that qualitative study, they looked at kind of how trans children developed over time. They were speaking to those children themselves as well as their parents. But they found that many of those parents from these different families said that it was the age of 3 when children seemed to increase in their rigidity about how they and their kind of intensity of their gendered expression. So that was the time when they became more confident in self-identifying, but also they became often more intense in the way that they conformed to the stereotypes associated with the gender that they felt that they aligned with. So
I suppose does that make sense in terms of, it sort of takes self-ID to know which group to which you belong, and then the social drivers of kind of social belonging
yes.
and
So those
have the opportunity to
those children were feeling that, so I know now what I feel, and now I'm going to learn how to I'm going to really stick to the stereotypes that are associated with that group. And actually in that paper, it's really interesting because these families described how over time, once they felt that once those trans children felt that the people around them had accepted them as trans, had accepted that their gender identity, that they had told everyone, that they had told these people that was their identity, but they then lessened the intensity of that gendered expression and kind of seemed to go through this process where they started to realize that there was a difference between your identity and your expression, and that it was okay not to be kind of really going with all of the stereotypes about being a girl. You could actually still be interested in some things that could be considered stereotypically a boy activity or a boy clothing or whatever it may be, but that doesn't affect your sense of identity. But it's almost like at first, children, when they are at that kind of age of 3, those things are very intertwined for them. So they feel if I'm a girl, I must do all of the things that are associated with being a girl that I've learned about from the kind of society around me. And that's when I know I've definitely seen in kind of preschoolers when they start getting really, really going down the route of the sex segregation thing as well. And like, I only play with boys, I hate girls, or whatever it is that they start to say. Like my niece at the moment, interestingly, we went out, and my husband is great at interacting with her. That she very much likes a lot of activities that would stereotypically be kind of like considered male activities. But she's just hit that kind of sex segregation, kind of intergroup bias type thing, and suddenly like I'm the best thing ever because she sees that I'm a girl, and she was talking a lot about we're the girls and we're going to walk together and the boys have to be behind us. And you see that kind of real intensity in how they are expressing their gender, how they are speaking about gender, how much they are considering it in their life as they're learning about the kind of binary systems that they are existing in. And then as their logic and their reasoning and their kind of skills in realizing that there is a separation between the way you express yourself and how you feel inside, and they start to realize that it is a bit more nuanced, that's when in I think the general population, but also in this study we're talking about trans children, then became more confident to stray from some of those binary ideas because they recognized that expression wasn't, you didn't have to express yourself in a very, very stereotyped way to still have that gender identity that you feel as a separate concept. So that was very evident in that study, but also when you looked at the trajectories that we found when we looked at things like clothing preference, where children seem to have these peaks at the age of about 3, where they really are very gender conforming, and then their gender conformity may start to decline as they realize that actually our expression isn't everything, and that it's more about how you feel when we're talking about gender identity. So I think there are different age groups where they're using more expression to make that judgment, and then as they get older, perhaps using more kind of self-identification and understanding of gender as a sense of feeling aligned to a certain group. So interesting.
That's okay. So that is wild to me. It really is nuanced, isn't it? I suppose the question underlying all of this you might not be able to answer, and I don't know would be a totally legitimate answer to this question, because I don't know if I know. But I guess the question that's in my mind is, given the kind of the how preferential looking is shaped in the early years to gendered kind of peer preferences and clothing preferences and toy preferences to a little later as kids are able to self-ID and be able to work out what gender they are. And the distinction as they start to come to the conclusion, which I thought was super interesting, that they themselves start to recognize that there's a distinction between how somebody expresses themselves and how like the gender they are on the inside. So I guess the question that's still in my mind, and it might be a question that we just have open, is to what extent is that identity that they come to recognize in themselves a process of creation, or to what extent is it a process of discovery, or is it a little column A, little column B?
Yeah, I think so. The more I kind of, I started off thinking that perhaps it would be something that would be a simple answer. But actually, the more I've kind of looked into it, the more I understand that there are so many factors that are influencing someone's gender identity, from both their kind of biology, like at the moment, people are starting to suddenly realize about kind of how nuanced biology can be when you're thinking about someone's gender, particularly at this time. And then also the nuances of kind of social interactions, the kind of way that they, when you start to even think it could be like even the way that they're held as a child that could be influencing this, you realize it's so nuanced. And I think that it's made me realize that lots of things could be contributing, and it would be impossible to narrow it down to it's completely the way that a child is interacted with and it's something that you learn, or it's completely a biology thing. It would be impossible to kind of narrow it down. And I think now the kind of conclusion of my research was that it's impossible even to narrow down the definition to one of those things. So when we start to think about policies and all of the things that are currently kind of changing in politics at the moment, I think it just disregards so much evidence to then focus in on one very singular aspect of someone's gender identity as the way of defining gender identity when we're thinking about these types of things. But the other thing that I kind of kept coming back to, and that I kind of always think is important to remember, is that there are always people who do not fit with the kind of norms and and for whom the kind of way they've been interacted with, the biology they have, doesn't explain the gender identity that they feel that sense of belonging with and that they feel inside. So I think whilst these things are kind of really interesting to explore and they are interesting to understand in terms of how children are understanding gender identity and how adults are understanding it, I still think it's important to remember that there always have been, there always will be trans people who there's something about their gender identity that hasn't been influenced by these things.
Right.
And so I think it's impossible to kind of narrow it down or try and decide which of these things might be building someone's gender identity. I think it's just important to land on the conclusion that it's incredibly complex. And if you can imagine being, because there are all of these things are factors that are influencing our gender identity, if you can imagine being somebody where your sense of identity doesn't align with all of these like messages that you're getting from all angles, how difficult that must be, because it's incredibly complicated. And I think it shows that it's a kind of incredibly complicated thing for other people to understand. But I think I will always come back to the fact that actually people know themselves. It seems in these studies that people know themselves over time, that it tends to stay quite stable once someone has felt that sense of what their identity is. It tends to kind of stay stable over time. We looked at how those measures correlated over time. And so, however complicated it is, often people do just understand themselves very well. And we can't kind of simplify those people into trying to kind of understand it using one particular way of conceptualizing gender. You can't simplify it like that, but you can. But for each person, it can be quite simple that they just know themselves and they know that sense of how they feel internally. And it can get quite messy when people try to unpick it and understand it when they're thinking about, oh, but how do they look and who do they play with and what toys are they using and do they like the color pink or whatever it may be. But actually, I think the self-identification thing is where maybe things are lacking in the research, because it's unusual to me, like you said right at the beginning, it's like really strange to me that that was used less with these children, because I think people are wary of a child's ability to be able to self-identify because of how complicated all this is. But when you look at the studies where they have identified themselves, it tends to remain quite stable. They know themselves. And so
I love that guiding principle of like the message that that it takes time and that it's complicated. It's wonderfully nuanced. I love hearing you talk about it because it's I feel like I'm learning a great deal listening to you about like gender identity is a complicated and multifaceted thing that changes over time for people, but that when you get the opportunity to ask people, ultimately it tends to stabilize, and fundamentally the message sounds like it is that we can trust people to know themselves in time.
Yeah, I think I don't know how clear I was in that. I was kind of rambling, but I think that it seems like to me that the process, the fact that all of these things contribute to someone's gender identity makes it confusing for other people when someone's expression doesn't maybe align with their identity. It makes it confusing for other people if their understanding of gender is that it's all to do with activity preference or clothing preference, and then that's not quite aligning with something else. And it must be very confusing for a young person or an adult or whoever it may be if they within themselves are having different are changing over time in relation to all of these different factors that other people are saying, but that might mean this or that might mean this. But I think that's why, to me, the process of kind of allowing someone to explore their gender identity is so important to me, because I think with all other kind of aspects of our personality and our interests and our appearance and our expression, society seems to be quite comfortable with us using our adolescence as a time where we explore all those things. And I think this is something that's so complicated. Having that time to kind of explore, to understand, to come to that realization that perhaps our expression isn't the thing that's the most important. It must be that is linked to our gender identity, but it also could be, doesn't matter if that doesn't quite align with how you feel internally. That's a process for someone to understand. And I think we tend to learn things best when we just explore them and try it out and try things out and kind of try and understand it through our own experiences. And so I think it's one of those things where I try to reassure people that not even when you've read millions of things about gender do people really understand gender identity, because it is so complicated. So we can't expect someone's parents or a child or teachers, whoever it is, to fully understand that child and all of these different factors that could have influenced them. But we can allow someone to kind of tell us how they're feeling, tell us how they are, and allow them to explore that, so that then over time they can come to a kind of stable position where they feel that sense of knowing themselves without feeling that sense of everything being very complicated. And like I said, however much we try to understand why or how gender identity is formed, or what point do children know that what gender they are, things like that, there will always be diversity, and there will always be trans children, and there always have been, who don't fit with some of these ideas that people have about how gender identity form, because they may well have been in a society that is extremely binary, but they've still come out of it as like a wonderfully diverse person. So I think just allowing people to explore these things, knowing that no one will have the answers. There's no person who would be able to kind of, I think anyone, if you ask them to summarize their entire sense of identity around gender, it would be really difficult. But just having that process of exploration, knowing that it is complicated, knowing that there are differences between someone, things like the genderbread model, where you know then that there are going to be differences in someone's expression and their identity and their sexuality and kind of just sitting with that complicatedness, and but having a sense that people do know themselves.
It's a beautiful message. Can I ask one final question? It's a question that I got a funny feeling might become a bit of a tradition on the podcast. We are maybe going to have young people who are gender diverse or questioning, watching this and hearing your expertise. If you were to give them a message, what would it be?
I think it would be kind of what I've just said, that you know yourself, and even if you don't feel that you fully know yourself, you're on a journey to knowing yourself. Nobody knows themselves when they are, and as straight away you have to kind of go through that process of trying things out, testing things out, and it might be it's a very difficult situation to be expected to explain yourself to people who are a bit confused about what it is that you're trying to explain to them. But you are welcome, you are valid, you are just an amazing part of human diversity, and you have to kind of try to block out the fact that there are people who don't understand these things and who are fearful of these things, because there's just no need for it. There's no need for it. And it's just such an important part of kind of humanity to have this diversity. And things at the moment are rough and just so kind of demoralizing, but there are always people who are trying to kind of understand things better for you, so that we can explain it to these people and things hopefully will improve.
That's a wonderful, wonderful message to leave our listeners with. Thank you so very, very much for your time, as generously given as it always is. It has been wonderful to talk to you. I feel like I've learned a huge amount. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks so very much to Dr. Fisher for her time, as generously given as it always is. I'm so glad that you got the opportunity to spend some time with her too, because she's an absolute gem in the field, and so incredibly skilled in her explanation of some really complicated ideas, offering nuance in a field that so easily gets oversimplified. But underlying all of it, she communicates this beautiful message that trans folk are valid and that people fundamentally know themselves. And it is okay for us to, believe people when they tell us something about their gender identity, that fundamentally you're not alone, you are valid. And together we can make a world where everyone can find a place to belong. Thanks so very, very much for joining me. This is Classroom Psychology. You are so very, very welcome here. And I look forward to seeing you, as always, in the next one.